Hello, Victoria. Marcelo, it's a pleasure to be here for this session. I know you have your phones already, so this is a session that is held in English because we have with us, we have the pleasure to have with us Victoria Barbary, who has been a great partner in the recent year. Victoria has been in Brazil for one of our seminars held by our Fórum in UFRJ, and it's a pleasure to have you again here. Victoria, thank you. I'll introduce her, and also I'll introduce the curriculum of Marcelo. So I'll start with Victoria as a panelist. She's the Director of Strategy and Communications at the International Forum of Sovereign Wealth Funds, a global network of sovereign wealth funds with members from almost 40 countries. In her role, Victoria works with IFSWF members to curate a program of online and offline knowledge sharing and networking activities related to all aspects of their operations, from governance to investment strategies. Victoria has also worked in the sovereign wealth fund world for over a decade and has become a noted author and commentator on SWFs. In 2012, she founded the Sovereign Wealth Center, an online provider of data and analysis about SWFs, now part of Institutional Investors Sovereign Investors Institute. Before joining IFSWF, Victoria was a director of Investec Asset. So thank you, Victoria, and then I'll also introduce Marcelo before we move on. Marcelo Seraphim is head of the Responsible Investment Ecosystem in Brazil, representing the PRI, Principles for Responsible Investment in the country since 2018. He was a consultant to the United Nations for the incorporation of ESG issues into the regulatory framework of the Brazilian financial market. He has more than 25 years of professional experience in multinationals and in the public service, where he worked as a specialist in supplementary pensions for over 6 years, which is one of the issues that keeps coming up here with us. A business administrator with an MBA from Universidade de São Paulo, he holds a master's degree in public management from Columbia University. So the structure of this panel is a little different. We have these initial remarks, but Ana and I, we are going to have questions that we have prepared and shared with our panelists, and then head it to the audience for a few questions from you also. So thank you both. I'll let Ana hold the first questions, and then we can share it again.
Thank you, Leandro. Thank you, Victoria and Marcelo. Thank you, everyone. So I'll start with Marcelo. Marcelo, my question to you as an ESG expert who's been working in that front for decades already is a little bit about what can we learn from the ESG journey throughout the years for sovereign wealth funds. So in general, when we talk about ESG, we're mostly focusing on the issue of doing no harm. So basically, different sources of investments will look into what are the investments that cannot happen. This specific feature of ESG is being mostly provoked to become a little bit more bold and move towards actually doing good and finding the best portfolios for climate solutions rather than just avoiding doing bad stuff. So how can we learn from all of this experience that you have from ESG specifically for sovereign wealth funds? Thank you.
Thank you, Ana, and thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be, although it's a Friday in Rio and I have to go back to São Paulo, right? But yeah, it's a very good question, Ana. However, when we say something about doing no harm, I think it depends on the sector and on the company we are talking about. Like, for example, we see that, we just saw that BNDES has like 50% of its portfolio within the Petrobras shares. And Petrobras, of course, it's a high emitter of greenhouse emissions. But BNDES is one of the most important sustainable development banks in the world, and they do carry Petrobras shares in their portfolio. And how it happens? How is that? It's because BNDES understand, of course, the importance of Petrobras, but more than that, BNDES engages with Petrobras to try to help them to decrease their emissions through changing technology or investing in other ways of generating energy and so on. So this is really a smarter way of doing sustainable finance, because if you just exclude these opportunities, it probably, if an investor, for example, doesn't want to have Petrobras shares in the portfolio anymore and sells the shares, maybe an irresponsible investor will get their shares and will not do anything to help the company do better than this. So, it's very important to see this difference. So, although Petrobras is a higher emitter company, even though investors can make through what we call stewardship, can engage with the company and help the company to, and of course, we have a lot of tools to do it, right? And the PRI, for example, is one of the organizations that help investors to do it, what we call the engagement and stewardship. So that's the smartness in the ESG. Excluding is might not be the right solution in terms of incorporating ESG in an investor decision portfolio. So, and there are a lot of other approaches for ESG, more sophisticated than excluding or screening, like we say, like integrating in the process, because as you know, ESG is one of the factors that an investor analyst has to consider in his analysis. So it's only part of the analysis, but that has to be included, of course. So I think throughout these years, the sophistication of the incorporation of ESG issues has been increasing throughout the years, and I think that the sovereign funds will start, at least here in Brazil, are starting to get a more developed market in terms of knowledge of incorporating ESG issues, and I hope we as PRI can help the sovereign funds to go into this journey.
I was just thinking how we're looking into that framework of doing no harm and to doing good and increasing experiences that we're having from especially European and US regulators to also bring the level of exposure that a portfolio has towards adaptation, of exposure in terms of transition risks, of physical risks. Are we also including little by little a third category there into that framework, which is doing things well done, just doing it with less risk?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I had to, I forgot to complement my answer. Of course, doing no harm, sometimes it's difficult, but sometimes it's needed in this kind of sectors and the companies. But in terms of the alternatives that the investor has, in terms of capital allocation, we have a lot of opportunities to do it, to invest with a bigger impact. So now we're not talking about just risk management, but really investing in alternatives that really impacts positively the society, the environment. So, for example, we were talking about a conference that we had last month in São Paulo, only dedicated to nature-based solutions. So this is the kind of opportunities that the sovereign funds can have also in terms of, allocating capital in their portfolio. So it's only one of the examples. So but there are a lot of opportunities, especially here in Brazil, where we have a lot of opportunities to, solve some issues of degraded lands and etc. So I think it's a good example.
Thank you, Marcelo. Anna reminded me that I skipped the first sheet of I have in my hands, which is to talk about ourselves, actually. I have to introduce Anna way better. Anna is an economist and public administrator specializing in climate development policies and public policy evaluation. At Systemic, she leads a team that support the voluntary task force of Brazil's ecological transformation plan, something that we also hear a lot about in recent days. At the World Bank, she assessed private sector engagement in climate action. At the IDB, she has evaluated national portfolios, including cultural adjustments to support for indigenous people. At J-POL, she supported climate resilience impact assessment, like the Cisterns program. Before that, she worked with local governments, including guiding climate and nature protection actions. She's a guest lecturer at FGV, INSPER, and FAP, and mentors young professionals. And we've worked together in one of those local governments for the City Hall of São Paulo. And also introduce myself. I'm Leandro, and I hold a bachelor degrees in public policy management from University of São Paulo. I'm the president of the Brazilian Basic Income Network and part of the team that also takes on the research on the basic income program of Marica. I also have a public policy master's degree from Universidade Federal do ABC, and I'm a PhD candidate in economic development for the University of Campinas. I'm the director of the initiative of the Fórum, and I have two questions for Victoria. And the questions, Victoria, are very much related to things that we had the chance to talk about in the last 2 days, both in Brasilia and also here with authorities in Rio. It has a lot to do with the purpose of the funds. We have the takeaways from COP28 for more resources to be invested in energy transition, especially. But we also have the purpose for these funds to impact their realities. So we want to know from you, from how you follow the sovereign wealth funds in the last decade, how they have shifted their investments towards more sustainability, more investments in climate actions and opportunities like that. You've been telling about us, you've been telling about the research that you keep every year about this topic. And then we also want to know how much of this has a local impact and how can you assess whether these funds are more and more investing in their own communities in this kind of initiatives. So please, Victoria.
Okay, thank you, Leandro. So I think I'll start by kind of putting a little bit of context, which is sovereign wealth funds have to be A, financially motivated, and B, independent of government, so they can't be interfered with. And traditionally, since the early 2000s, the opinion has been, that climate and climate change was a policy issue. It was not a financial issue, and therefore it was not under their remit. Their job was to make money. For me, an anecdote is I joined IFSWF in 2016, and we were in New Zealand, and the New Zealanders have traditionally been very, very keen on climate. And we had the whole theme of our annual meeting was on climate in Auckland. And one of my very large members tapped me on the shoulder about 20 minutes into the first session and said, "Victoria, what's this thing called ESG? I've never heard of it." And I thought, oh dear. And really, that was the kind of feeling around climate issues until 2020, which was a real, I think, generally it was inflection point for investors, not only because of the pandemic, but because of the general disaster of floods, wildfires, and general other hurricanes that happened in 2020. And so what we, as Leandro said, we do a survey. Since 2020, we've done a survey on climate, sovereign wealth funds' approaches to climate every year. And in 2020, really the results of that survey showed that there was a lot of chit-chat, a lot of talk about thinking about climate, but very little action. And the reason any of our members was properly considering it was because it was, quote unquote, the right thing to do. And if I fast forward to last year's survey, because we do it at the end of the year, so this was done at the end of 2023, just under a year ago. Most of the sovereign wealth funds, this is a survey of around 34, 35 sovereign wealth funds. The reason they're addressing climate is because they believe it is going to impact their bottom line. Now it is a financial issue. And I think that that is the biggest change, which has meant that the use of tools like carbon footprinting, like climate scenario analysis, putting in place transition plans, is now actually happening rather than being considered. So I think that that is the biggest change and that is not, and I think it's not about whether your assets come from petroleum or not. It's not necessarily a diversification issue. Like I would have 10 years ago, I was like, if your fund comes from oil, you shouldn't be investing in oil, period. Because when your inflows go down, your portfolio is also going to go down. That was always my argument. But now it's just generally everybody is considering this. And there is a very wide range of approaches. So a lot of sovereign wealth funds started thinking about climate purely from a risk perspective. And some funds are still very much in that mode. And I will take that, right? I will take the fact that they're considering it. But I think increasingly some of the larger funds are looking at this as an opportunity. And in the opportunities, traditionally, they've gone quite safe. So in the last 5 years, we've seen a massive increase in their investment in renewable energy infrastructure. So whether that's wind, whether that's solar, those have been the main ones. But that's traditionally been in developed markets. It's been in Europe, it's been in the US. In the last 18 months or 2 years, we've seen a bit of a change. And I think that this is for two reasons. One, in the US, the IRA, so the Inflation Reduction Act, which is putting a lot of government money towards the energy transition, is effectively crowding out foreign capital. And it's also increasing asset values because there's more competition. So it's really less attractive as a market. Even though there's a huge opportunity, the government are trying to get American finance into that. On the flip side, in Europe, there's a similar kind of program, but there's also some new rules coming in around state aid, which would enforce sovereign wealth funds being government-owned to kind of open out their entire balance sheet to the European Commission, which is basically putting a lot of people off. And asset values are very high. So what we've seen more broadly is sovereign wealth funds saying, we need to find other markets to invest in because this is still a really valuable opportunity. So this focus on developing markets has at the moment mostly focused on Africa, if I'm really honest. And the reason is our forum has lots of African members. There are 20 African sovereign wealth funds. There are lots of them. And these sovereign wealth funds aren't your traditional savings funds. They're very much, they're what we call strategic investment funds, and I'll talk about that a bit later. But they're looking to encourage investment into their own countries. So if we look like a country like Egypt, it's huge on encouraging investment into solar, into green hydrogen, and that money is coming in from the Arabian Gulf countries. But also, there is an attempt to look at these opportunities and in terms of impact, I think just to underline, sovereign wealth funds are not impact investors, and I find this term very annoying, really, because it has a very specific meaning. But I think what we're seeing is if you're going to measure, monitor, and mitigate what you're doing in terms of climate or in terms of social or in whatever, actually you need to measure the impact that you're having. And I think that that's now becoming more apparent. So we're seeing sovereign wealth funds increasingly actually paying attention to their carbon emissions, to the social impact that they're having. Although I will underline, they are not impact investors. So I'll leave it there.
Well, thank you. It's very good. And I now am specifically guided not to use the impact anymore. But it got me when you said something about the strategic fund. So if you want to make additional comments on how this Africa experience, for example, for the strategic funds look like, I think they have a lot of things in common with the Brazilian scenario, with the Latin American scenario, and we certainly would like to learn more about this if you can do some more comments about it.
So in about 2010, sovereign wealth funds suddenly became very fashionable in international circles. Everybody wanted a sovereign wealth fund. It was post-financial crisis. It was the thing to have. It showed you were fiscally responsible. And so even if you didn't have a big fiscal surplus, which has traditionally been the asset base of a sovereign wealth fund, particularly in Africa, but also in Asia, a lot of countries were saying, we want a sovereign wealth fund. We want to sit with the Abu Dhabi investment authorities, the GICs of the world. And so the innovation came to take some money from the budget each year, regardless of whether you had a surplus, and you were going to take that money and put it towards investing at home for profit and for economic development and diversification. So they are what we call strategic investment funds. Now, a critical role for them, not all, but the majority of these institutions, is to be the partner of choice for foreign direct investors. So they will create a pipeline of deals. Being government owned, they can reduce the legal risk, the political risk. They've got local knowledge, and they can help source co-investors. And so what they're doing is taking a small amount of the capital structure and bringing in private capital from also in their country, but also abroad, to create these major projects. It is primarily an infrastructure, and as we were talking about earlier, I think that modern infrastructure in developing economies is just green. It's not climate, you shouldn't call it green infrastructure, it's just modern infrastructure. You're not arbitraging, deciding to put a coal plant into a solar farm, right? No one is putting new coal plants in, except the Chinese. So I think that that all these countries are looking to develop modern, efficient, green infrastructure. And I think increasingly we've talked a lot, I think, about adaptation and mitigation. In many countries around the world, we're now actually primarily talking about resilience. So being climate resilient. If you are in Africa and you're in the Sahel, you are at the sharp end of climate change. And even in the Persian Gulf, I think it was 54 degrees in Kuwait City 2 weeks ago. It's the hottest temperature ever recorded. It's becoming unlivable. So I think we're seeing a real change. But these strategic investment funds are taking on risk. They're finding projects, and they're bringing in foreign direct investors and private sector investment. And this has been enormously successful. Both it's a model that's come out of Africa, but it has been very successful in other areas of the world as well.
Thank you so much, Victoria. I'll ask you another question, if that's okay. So basically, sovereign wealth funds can be considered as a source of income for rainy days. Let's say if you have a depletion process that is maybe about to end. We have seen news about the pré-sal case in Brazil, which is very concerning. So we don't have the perspective that some of these depletions will have infinite supply. It can also work when you have a lot of volatility in the commodity that the country is dedicated to or the region. So considering these features of sovereign wealth funds to be holding this kind of safety net for a community that depends on that kind of income, what are the uses for sovereign wealth funds that are not yet applied in economic activities that happen in developing countries that maybe Brazil and other developing countries can learn from? As a specific question or example that we can consider is our exports of iron ore. So most of our balance, external balance is based on exports of primary goods. That includes soybeans, that includes oil, crude oil, that includes iron ore as well. Should we be considering as a country to maybe make use of that kind of tool for that, or would that not be the best application, and why so?
So you can basically fund a sovereign wealth fund from anything. So one of our members in Botswana is funded from the sale of diamonds, is a good example. Chile, sovereign wealth funds are from the sale of copper. So I think it's really about, and so you can find the money from anywhere, and most of our members are funded from, as I said, quite often just out of the budget. It doesn't have to be a hydrocarbon. To your point around stabilization, I think this is really important. And COVID was a very good example of this. Stabilization funds are quite a traditional way of using, and if you think of Mexico, Botswana does this, and Chile has a stabilization fund. And these are rainy day funds, and if COVID wasn't a rainy day, I've not seen a rainy day and I live in London. So, you know, I think that it's those uses of and having that stabilization and to support currency values to reduce volatility, that is a perfectly legitimate use of funds. I think the challenge comes nowadays, because you know the world has moved and we are no longer in 2008. I think the challenge comes with when those funds get totally depleted, and then Colombia is a really good example of this, right? They've got two funds, they go up to about $1 billion, and they hit $1 billion, and the government spends it, and then they go up, and then they go down, because they're using it to stabilize the budget. I think this is where fiscal discipline comes and says, we need to put some away. Yes, we need a stabilization fund to a degree, but we also need to say we have to put some away for the benefit of future generations. And another trend we've seen, which is really quite interesting, is that what is investing for future generations has changed, and this is pretty much universal across sovereign wealth funds, that increasingly, particularly those from emerging and developing countries, but also in developed countries, are seeing that actually returns for future generations is coming from investing at home rather than simply abroad. So you can look at the Qatar Investment Authority. They've done a lot at home recently. You can think of Mubadala, I mean, big investor in Brazil, but also it's come from its native country. It was a strategic investment fund, but it still invests at home because it sees the opportunities. Because in developing countries, often the IRRs are higher, right? So I think that's important. So having that idea that as we were talking about, that change of culture to think about just from spending to actually saving some and having that discipline. But to your point around funding, I think for Latin America, sitting in London, which is a long way away. I mean, it's a long flight. I'm not, joking about that. The day flight is particularly unpleasant. But essentially, I think there's a huge opportunity, and I'll talk about this later, but with the trend, with the geopolitical situation as it is now, Latin America's mining wealth, so for critical minerals, so lithium, cobalt, graphene, graphite, all of those, that is a massive opportunity to create new you don't have to save all of it, but taking some of that and putting it away, because the US are going to need non-China linked supply chains. And I think that this is kind of a potential for a second generation of sovereign wealth funds. So I think it's really important not to get hung up on where the money comes from. You know, dollars is dollars is dollars. It doesn't matter what made the dollars. You know, it is just dollars. So I think that that's really important.
So I want to go back to Marcelo. If you consider the typical features of sovereign wealth funds, like being owned by government, as Victoria just told us, but she has made it very clear in recent days for us about the necessity of government participation to de-risk investments from other partners that also have sovereign wealth funds, and the longer-term secured income that the funds provide, and also the long-term competitiveness of climate investments, especially related to energy transition and some of those strategic investments with a focus in local strategies. What do you feel from the PRI perspective that are the best instruments that fits the strategies for those funds? And perhaps how can you describe them for the Brazilian scenario and the funds that we have in our Fórum scenario?
Thank you. Good question. I think that we have a huge opportunity with the sovereign funds, as Victoria said, in Brazil, especially because you have all this good influence from the government now, of course, because we have a very good scenario, political scenario to make, to help this kind of funds to invest, to allocate capital in more impactful opportunities. And of course, in terms of instruments, we have a lot of like green bonds, sustainability-linked bonds, social bonds, etc. And that, of course, this kind of instruments really help to green your portfolio, and really helps to develop the green financial market in Brazil, and the green economy, of course. However, I think I agree with Marcelo from Patria that the alternative investments are more prone to develop the real economy, and also has this good impact in the portfolio because of the diversification in the portfolio and so on. And also in terms of, for example, the infrastructure investments, everybody knows that you can have the protection of against the inflation, because most of the revenues from infrastructure are adjusted against inflation and so on. So it's a particularly interesting investment, also economically speaking. But I think investors, especially with the profile that the sovereign funds have, I think it's a very good opportunity to link these investments in infrastructure with green infrastructure, of course, the ones that can help mitigate, physical risks, or help to remediate, adverse events that we have. For example, we've had in Rio Grande do Sul, for example. So there are a lot of good instruments that we can use with the, that fit with the profile of a sovereign funds, like long-term focused and so on. So, and especially now that you saw the presentation from BNDES, and BNDES is a very important actor to help de-risk these opportunities, these investments, especially in the very beginning of this greenfield type of investments. So I think it's a great opportunity for this kind of funds to really help the country to develop, to have a very sustainable development.
Thank you so much, Marcelo. I was here thinking how it is tricky to think that while we're looking into all of these sovereign wealth funds as interestingly committed to a energy transition, as we were saying, it's more than just out of their own kind of good intention. It also comes from a place of, well, the world is changing, we need to move forward to other alternatives. Sometimes there's also the depletion aspect of that will impact their financials as well. But how there may be some sort of perverse incentive in which if you have a local energy transition, you may not need as much oil or coal as you needed once before. So maybe I'm just thinking about how that, and that may be a question for Victoria as well, and even just a general reflection on that kind of potential perverse incentive of you to have a local community that depends on that kind of exports and what's going to happen after that, even during the process of transitioning. So probably this means that whichever investments are chosen by the sovereign wealth funds, they also have to be very much locally thought. We can learn a lot from external experiences and what kind of portfolio they had, but also what is the local context? What's the kind of energy transition that makes sense for this country? For instance, maybe for Brazil, it makes more sense to work towards sustainable aviation fuel than necessarily towards solar, because in a specific municipality, you already have plenty of renewable energy. So you don't want to just focus on the obvious international choices, but rather what makes sense locally. Do you have any experience into looking what are the very local processes of investment for an energy transition? Maybe some of these African examples that Victoria was bringing earlier on, just provoking. Leandro, it also applies to you in case you want to jump in.
So I think there's a couple of things. I spoke about economic development and diversification. I think it's really important and that economies are diverse. So economies that are overly reliant on extractives are naturally quite fragile. So it is, I would say it's part of public policy to make sure that you are developing skills more broadly and having a more diversified economy, particularly in the context of the energy transition. But it's also, I think, about making economies more resilient. And that's not just about building resilient infrastructure, as I was saying earlier. It's about thinking about your economy holistically. And this is where these strategic investment funds can be really helpful. So if you look at some of the funds in Africa, but also in Asia, where they've decided that yes, we have, we're reliant on oil, but in that case, we need to think about investing in telecoms and IT. And that's a huge, kind of integrated move from we need to improve education, but it's about thinking about it holistically. But I also think there's a climate angle to this, right? So if you look at Nigeria, which is not normally a country you'd kind of put up as an example of good practice, but we're going to do it, which is Nigeria noticed that it had a real problem with lung disease and lung cancer. And lots of people were coming into Lagos with these problems and dying. So the Nigerian Sovereign Investment Authority decided, which is the sovereign wealth fund, decided to invest in oncology. And then they were working out, well, why is this happening? And it turned out that most of the people that were coming in with lung cancer were women who were cooking inside on solid fuel, i.e. wood, that they were cutting down from Nigeria's rainforests, causing deforestation and the shrinking of Lake Chad. And not only that, as Lake Chad shrinks, you end up with conflict, and as we know, Nigeria has a huge conflict in the north. So this is a really holistic line, just from looking at lung cancer rates, right? So what they've done is thought about this entirely holistically. So they're going from, right, we don't want people to cook on solid fuel anymore. So we're going to do local level electrification and gas stoves. And then we're going to make sure that, so people are not cooking with this, but we're also going to make sure that we continue to invest in oncology so that then other people from around the region are going to come to Lagos and we can develop a medical hub, which is one of those things that is a complete diversifier to their economy. So I think we have to think that's just one example of this holistic thinking that's making Nigeria's economy much more resilient, but also much better for the environment. So it's one of those things where it's using your strategic investment fund as a way of implementing public policy, but making money out of it and basically supercharging it by using private capital. Because those hospitals were not paid for entirely by the Sovereign Wealth Fund. They were mostly paid for by European, US, and Asian medical providers. And they're making money out of it. So I think this is one of those places where you have to really think about an economy as a holistic beast, if you like. Because you're right, I mean, we've been seeing today that Brazil has lots of renewable energy, but actually we're always going to need oil because there are these things called petrochemicals that we really, really need, and medicines and all these other things. So it's not necessarily about oil is going to disappear entirely. It's, do we need to think about bolstering our petrochemical sector? You've got all these oil wells, you might as well use them. So, and you've got all this infrastructure that's been spent, people have, so you need to think about, because that's also got carbon embedded in it, because concrete is obviously very, very carbon intensive, and you don't want to start just breaking it up for no reason. So there's all of these things. It's incredibly complicated, and I don't even begin to have a handle on how it all fits together, but you do have to have that integrated systems thinking. And this is a huge change, both in sovereign wealth fund investment, but also in public policy that needs to take place.
Just adding in the context of your question, we always say, speak about the just transition, right? Because we really need a transition that is fair in terms of social issues. So we cannot just dismantle an industry and neglect all the social impact that this has. So your question is very good also in this sense. You have to understand, as Victoria said, the holistic impact of this transition. So and how the private sector and the government can work together to make this transition, socially just, right?
Thank you, Marcelo, and thank you, Victoria. Fernando, Paul, and I, we've been in touch with the Nigerian experience, and we've pretty much looked at it as also as an institutional format that is very interesting for the Brazilian case, but nothing like a story to tell about how people got their lives better after assessing correctly the situation you mentioned about deforestation and cancer caused in women. So it's very interesting. It was very nice to hear, and we can use it, right? We can definitely use it. But just to address your question, Anna, Paul and I, we've been to Vale do Jequitinhonha, where the critical minerals exploitation is taking place, and we've saw scenarios that are definitely not according to a just transition at all. So critical minerals are fundamental for the transition itself, but it has been a tragedy, just like the others cycles that they experience in terms of mining. So it has been very, very interesting to have this possibility, also because we hope that correctly assessed the situation could generate new funds, for example, or at least new planning for the use of money. And that has a lot to do with what George said earlier about longer chains of value being developed. It's definitely not only for those specific communities, but for the country. We are, of course, as everybody is aware, exporting the raw lithium, and in the future we will be importing batteries. So it's definitely somewhere to go. But I don't want to take the time just for myself, and I know that Paul has a question, and maybe others also have. So I'm taking questions from the audience right now.
Well, thank you so much, Victoria and Marcelo. This has been such an interesting discussion. I really love the interview format. I just wanted to ask, something that, of course, is, I'm sure, very clear to everyone on the stage, but perhaps not everyone in the audience, is the growing tendency toward the creation of strategic development funds. And when you've got a sovereign wealth fund like Norway, for instance, whose goal is simply to earn a return in excess of the cost of debt for the Norwegian state, it's very clear how you demonstrate your impact, how you establish your legitimacy. When your goal is to not be an impact investor, but still to justify your existence on the basis of strategic investment, then I think it becomes important to think carefully about how to demonstrate impact. So I just wanted to hear from both of our panelists, what are the impact measures that you see of greatest interest to strategic development funds? Is there clear alignment among the funds about how impact should be demonstrated? Do you sort of see any tendencies here that are worth discussing as a group?
So we've done some work on this, and I think that there are far too many frameworks that you can use. There is also a problem with data and collecting data, and I think we've basically come up with the following, which is we don't mind which framework you choose. Choose a framework and implement it. Make sure that it's internationally recognized. Most of the strategic investment funds, I think, are migrating really to using the Sustainable Development Goals as their framework. The data is hard to gather, but if you are an equity investor in companies in your country, it's much easier to gather the data than it is if you are Norway and you own 1.5% of every listed company on the planet. So I think that actually for a lot of these funds, as long as you have a framework and you stick to it, it doesn't matter what that framework is. I think the data collection is really challenging, and that's a challenge for everyone. I think also it is a capacity. So if you are GIC out of Singapore and you can hire the smartest brains in the room, their model makes my head spin. It's so complicated, but it works. Not every sovereign wealth fund can do that. I mean, lots of sovereign wealth funds are literally managed by 3 men and maybe some part-time people. They're not all GIC with 1,300 employees. So I think that would be, it is challenging, but pick a framework, stick to it. The SDGs seem to be the general kind of standard. Marcelo?
I totally agree with Victoria that whatever framework you use, it's like you have to stick with that. But also I would add that it's very important that you have a very clear strategy and policies and practices. Because I think this way you will reach the targets you're looking for, So and of course we have a lot of different frameworks, like we have SASB, for example, and that is based for the IFSB with a lot of indicators and so on. And they've done a very good job on, working on these indicators and so on. But I think it's much more important if you have a very clear strategy, policy, and process implemented, and you get there.
If I may, wear my former evaluator hat, just to add that, of course, I guess it would be necessary to also have a sense of, along with the policies, what's the theory of change behind the fund? So if you're looking for an impact, where can we go beyond just the buzzword and actually have a sense of specific criteria? And of course, get the baseline. Do not forget about the baseline, because then it's going to be so hard for you to assess ex post. So even if you have to invest a little bit in research to make sure that you have the data beforehand as a baseline information, it's worth it, so that you can then claim that, you know, this is the fund investments are the source of the impact that you're claiming. Actually, if anyone else has a question. If no one has another question, I have a final one, which is jumping towards implementation. So I think we're moving towards that agenda in terms of like what's the strategy that can be adopted, what indicators can we look into, what's the kind of step-by-step that the people in here that are working with funds can think about. What I would like to ask is, we've looked at Espírito Santo presentation and how important it was for them to have a bank, which is a national, like a public bank that had a lot of state capacity, that is responsible to also bringing capacity to their fund. We're talking about BNDES and how BNDES is our national public bank, who has also been responsible for bringing so many innovations in terms of financial instruments, identifying where the financial instruments gap, and the Eco-Invest program is a great example of it, and especially when it comes to FX kind of risk that Brazil right now can perceive so strongly. So my question would be maybe not such a complex one. It's how important is it you who have seen sovereign funds being built and being put into place and deployed to society, how important is it to have that kind of institution behind a sovereign wealth fund? Is it necessary to have a sort of a bank? When you say mostly it's just 3 people who are running the sovereign wealth fund, how can we think of building capacity for these 3 people to build the fund? Are there important experiences for a shared built capacity that different municipalities can gather and just, or you know, other level of sub-national governments can gather and find common state capacity building solutions?
So I think the Espírito Santo example is very unusual. It's just, there may be another sovereign wealth fund somewhere out there that's used a development bank. There might have been. But I think so. If you look at, yeah, I mean, but this is the important thing, is innovation. No sovereign wealth fund is the same. So you look around, you find the problem and work out what the solution is, right? But I think so. What we've seen in most cases is you find it's usually a man, I'm afraid, but you find a guy who has private sector experience and you put him in charge of developing a team. And that has traditionally come from the private sector, and more often than not, it comes from diaspora. People who have international banking experience in Europe or in the US, and they want to come back to give something back, because you're not going to be paying private sector salaries, right? But you need that private sector experience. And yes, it's fabulous to have the state capacity, but ultimately I think often a sovereign wealth fund has to do a different job from a development bank. You know, it's a for-profit enterprise. It might have a double bottom line with an impact and impact KPIs, as we were just talking about, but ultimately it has a different set of skills. And you have to, and this is one of the hardest things, by the way, and I hear it all the time. How do you attract and retain talent when you're not paying? And quite often it's like, well, we give you a different experience. If you're in a private equity team, you get to go from origination to realization, and you get to see the whole thing, which in a private equity firm you would never get to do, because you'd be doing a little tiny piece. and you need to find the right people who want to give something back. And that generally is what I find with the people I work with, is they do the job because they feel it's important. And I think that that's the kind of team, but it's usually private sector experience. And even if it's a small team, it doesn't have to be ADIA size of 1,800 people sitting in a massive glass tower. It can be a small team, but as long as they have got the experience and the knowledge to do what they need to do, I think that's important. But the private sector experience, in my opinion, and from my, the last 17 years of my life, says that I think that that's really super important. Marcelo?
So, does anybody has a final question from the audience? So, to keep the time, I think we wrap up with this. We have another presentation from Victoria about the publication that from IFSWF that was translated into Portuguese. So I want to thank you very much, both Marcelo and Victoria, Ana, for joining me for this. I think we had a great format, and I appreciate that you joined us and also started some questions for both of us. And I hope you can stay with us for some more time, both for the publication presentation, but also for the cocktail that comes next. Thank you.